Hello, ladies and gentlemen. This is Alec Harrison here as a part of the Azure Back to School conference to teach you a little bit about using and deploying Azure static sites. A little bit about myself. I am originally an Iowa State grad, worked in Des Moines for a little bit, and recently relocated to Omaha, Nebraska. I have a lot of passion for Azure, so you might see me, if you follow me on LinkedIn, post about my user group in Kansas City for Azure or the Iowa Microsoft Azure user group if you're in the Des Moines metro area. My Sessionize is also linked here. You'll see me speaking at a few conferences here and there, like this one. We're going to kick off kind of talking the high level of static sites. Why would you want to use one? The first biggest selling point for me when I was looking into these is pricing, specifically the free. Some of these you'll see free and there'll be an asterisk. Some of them you'll go to see what the standard is and it'll say see pricing calculate. Sometimes in Azure, a lot of things are free or there's a price with asterisk. So with a free price to asterisk, I felt like that might have been a little too good to be true. So I dug a little deeper into it. This is another page, again, showing the little free to asterisk. And then if you click in to calculate the pricing of the other one, about $9 per app per month. So what does that get you? We'll go a little deeper into that. Bandwidth overages. So if we go back, you have your included bandwidth, which is 100 gigabytes per subscription. The overage only applies for your standard static web app. So if you want a static site hosted and you're on your local or on your subscription, say you hit 100 for the free tier, you'd hit 100 and then your static site just goes away. Microsoft will turn it off and you're just kind of out of luck. It's hard to hit that bandwidth number. However, if you do, it's just off. With the standard apps, static web app, you can actually pay for that overage. So Microsoft will not come in and just shut it off for all of your end users. They won't just make your web app non-existent anymore. You can still host your static content. And you just pay for that overage, which at 100 gigabytes, again, hard to hit, but if you do, or if you're playing at that scale, it's nice to know that you can just pay for the overage and not have to worry about not having it. Bring your own functions. What does that mean? So in your normal Azure function runtimes, you have your typical Node, .NET, and Python. For the free static web apps, you can also supply a backend. So this would be, if you need to make any sort of HTTP calls, you can use Azure Functions to do that. In the free tier, you can only use the managed functions. So that means you cannot provide your own runtime, you cannot bring your own functions. That essentially means that if you wanted to use Go, Ruby, something to that effect that you could get to run in an Azure function, you are not able to do that in the free tier. You would have to upgrade and pay for that, and then pay for the consumption of the Azure function as well. Which, for the most part, again, if you're going to be using something for free, Node, .NET, and Python have covered most of my needs. And you can also then pay for the consumption of the Azure function, which I believe you get so many cycles for free off the bat too. So, not a too big of a deal, but if you do have a language that maybe isn't a part of their managed, you can also pay a little bit more to get that functionality. Static site auth. Again, if you want to use the free one, you are a little limited on what you can and cannot do. So that includes Azure Active Directory, GitHub, and Twitter as login. Azure Active Directory does work with MSOL. I have used that before. I have not used Twitter or GitHub, but those are the other two. So if you want to, for example, use Auth0 as your primary authenticator, you will have to pay for a higher tier unless you can get it to work. But out of the box, the free tier will work with Azure AD, GitHub, and Twitter. And then if you noticed before, there's the asterisk on free. That is because they claim the only fee you will incur is for your storage costs. So the typical blob storage costs are, you'll be in this hot tier. Your first 50 terabytes will be about 2 cents per gigabyte. And then everything else you can see here. But for a static site, you will be in the hot tier. I still think there is some free. I can show you as a later example of my own personal website I've run in static sites. You don't end up actually paying this. There's either a rounding error or you get so much blob storage for free every month that I don't believe I've ever actually paid to host a site in a static site. The upsells are going to be your Azure front door. So what a front door is it helps you bring your content to your users. So all right here. That allows your users, whether if they're geo-dispersed, to have a entry point closer to them. So if you're out of East US and you have people in West US, East US, South America, Asia, all that, you can use front door to front their instances. So it's a little more responsive and they can cache those solutions. So that way your web app will perform better. Instead of having to ping all the way around the world or maybe to a different hemisphere, you can then just hit it right there. And there's some more benefits in here if you want to read all that. These are not benefits just for web apps. These are all the benefits for why you would use front door altogether. And it's just an upsell saying, front door does work with this. And here's some references I have for the nitty-gritty stuff. We're going to go through a walkthrough of how to actually implement your first site for free. And we'll go ahead and I'm going to briefly touch on, as a prerequisite, you'll have to create a resource group in Azure, and you'll also have to get your credentials set up into GitHub. I'm not going to walk through that just because those could be compromised. However, it'll be something that anybody can do if you just follow this walkthrough. One caveat I have noticed for static sites is, I don't believe it tells you this in the documentation, but yeah, it does not. You are only allowed 10 free static sites per subscription. So one thing I used to say doing this presentation before I started using them more is, oh yeah, if you're in dev, test, non-production environments, let's go ahead and roll out static sites because they're free. Why should we pay for them? Let's not. The downside to that is across a subscription, which a lot of times organizations will maybe have all of their dev environments or all of their test environments or all their prod environments, in a singular subscription. So if you have more than 10 apps, you're kind of in trouble. Or if all of your environments are in the same subscription, you're not going to be able to run very many environments with a free web app. That's not a huge deal. For the most part, if you start looking at the prices of app services, static apps tend to be a little bit cheaper still, especially if you're going in the serverless backend direction. So you don't need to pay for an app service at all. This is still a way to completely avoid that expense. However, if you start getting more and more applications, you're probably going to have to pay the $9 per app per month fee here, which will also allow you to bring bigger apps, bring your own functions, and also have the front door and SLA backed. So just something to keep in mind if you're going to be building a lot of apps, or this is going to be an organizational adoption, you will probably still be paying about that $9 to $10 a month if you have a decent team that uses multiple environments, or a decent sized organization that uses multiple environments. You're going to be kind of trapped into that pretty quickly. So we'll hop into our trivial example here of just deploying a simple web app this was started with the Angular Tour of Heroes. Depending on what conference or talk I give it to, I tweak kind of what the HTML is slightly. So just go out and search up for Angular Tour of Heroes. And my internet is fighting me on doing anything at the moment, it looks like. So if you want to go here, you can download the Azure CLI. It'll walk through on how you download the example, and you can run it with NPM locally. This works for any JavaScript application that you can build and output. So I'll show you an example. My personal site is a Gatsby site that is put out there. You can kind of use it with whatever you want, as long as you can put out the content and then serve it statically. So here's a project we have. We have a blank deployment bicep file and a blank pipeline file. So we're going to be using GitHub Actions, which once you have the login set up correctly, I'll show you a little bit what that looks like. You should have your own personal one of these. This is the example repo I'm going to be talking about. So if we go to Settings, Secrets, Actions, you should have walked through that walkthrough link and have these in here. I have an extra one for my resource group. That was strictly just because I was changing what resource groups I threw stuff in. It doesn't need to be a variable. It can be if you want to make it a little more secret or hidden, but it doesn't matter. So we'll go ahead and start with that. So this is assuming you have that, assuming you also have a resource group over here. So we'll go through that. Otherwise, if you don't have a resource group, you can kind of go a few different ways. You can create a resource group. And the reason I won't be creating a resource group live is to get the credentials to be able to have GitHub push to the Azure environment of your resource group. You do have to have the resource group already created. So if you don't know how to do that, you can walk through the UI. Resource groups are free. You end up paying for what's in them, not the resource group itself. It's just a way to, if you think of Azure as a big old bucket, a resource group is a way to kind of segment your bucket of stuff. So if you ever want to calculate billing based on a resource group, if you ever want to throw away an entire resource group, you can do stuff like that. And everything lives within a resource group. So some things to touch on with a resource group. You're going to have your name. I believe that needs to be globally unique. And then you're also going to have your region. Standard rule of thumb is to put your region closest to your end users. So wherever they happen to be is where you're going to want that. Other than that, it doesn't really matter. If you're talking about light enough applications, if you're talking about using front door, the resource group matters less and less because you can then, front load and cache where their entry point is to your app ecosystem. So it matters a little less. However, if you have all of your users, say in US Central, just put your resource group there. You can avoid some of the caching or some of the distance issues that come up with if you put it like over in Asia or somewhere else. So there's also CLI commands to create your resource group if you want to just stay in the PowerShell world when you run the login. However, I'll leave that up to you to Google if that is your particular cup of tea. So what we're going to do is we're going to use infrastructure as code to make a repeatable CI/CD pipeline to publish our web app. This might be a little overkill depending on how much you use your static web app. There's actually a lot of good GitHub extension or VS Code extensions for managing Azure subscriptions that are pretty great, and you can actually publish directly to your static web app from VS Code if you want to. However, most of us in a real working world there will be security in place that we can't just push directly from our local computer. And we also want to make something repeatable so that it works on my machine doesn't always apply. So what we're going to do is we're going to first build out our infrastructure as code file. So we're going to use Bicep. Microsoft has 2 languages that they support. There's ARM, which is the Azure Resource Manager templating language. It's more of a JSON format. I have another talk about why that's not the best. And then they have Bicep, which is the newer one that does transpile down into ARM. However, because it's a kind of an on-top layer, it's much more human readable. There's a lot more autocomplete functionality. And I think it just looks cleaner and it's easier to understand. So the first thing we're going to always want to start with when you write a Bicep template is you're going to want to start with the location. So this is telling you your resource group can have a location and your resources can live in a different location as well, which is kind of confusing that you're like, my bucket sits here, but my resources are going to sit over here, but they're like still in the bucket. To save myself from some of that mental logistics, we're going to use a param location string. So location is our variable name, and we're telling Bicep that it's of type string. The parameter versus variable is a parameter can be overwritten if you pass it in, whereas a variable is hard set. It is here, it is what it is, and typically you either hard code a variable or instead you will do some sort of function to grab it. What we're going to do is we're going to use a param. That's just the standard rule of thumb for a location, because then it can be overwritten. But the equal sign here, you'll notice, will give us a default value if nothing is passed in. So we're going to do resource group function. That's saying, hey, the resource group I'm trying to deploy into, grab that, and we're going to grab the location. So we don't have to worry about the mental gymnastics of my resource group is here, but my stuff is actually somewhere else, maybe even across the world. We're just going to let it know, hey, we want to grab that to use later. So our first and only resource we're going to use, we're going to call it static site. And the notation is Microsoft.web/static sites. And the nice thing about Bicep, another one, is it will show you all the available APIs, where if you're using ARM, that's something that you will regularly have to go and look up. Be like, okay, what version are they at now? Which one do I want to use? Every resource is not on the same API schedule, so they might be 100% the same, they might be 100% different. You don't have to deal with that with Bicep. We'll do equals, declare our resource. So a resource needs a name. We're going to call it our test site. This is the human readable name that will show up in the Azure portal. I'm going to do location, and we're going to set it to the location parameter up above. We're going to use the SKU, which is how in Microsoft terminology you say what tier you want to pay for. So because we're trying to get this for free, we're going to use the free tier. Note, not every option in Azure has a free tier. Typically, I would say most have a standard, sometimes S and then some sort of number, because there's different levels of standard. Some have production, which are P, and then some have basic as well, which is B. So if you look at like an app service, there's an F, a B, a P, and an S for free, basic, standard, premium, and the cost goes up a little bit for all that. And then there's also, I believe, isolated. So in this case, since we're trying to make it free, we want to keep it free. And we know that that option does exist. For ease of doing this quickly, we are going to have a annotation here which is going to let us output the deployment token so that we can reference it at a later step. There's a warning here if you do this. Actually, in GitHub, it will blow up your pipeline. However, if you do this in Azure DevOps, it lets you without having to disable. There's probably a better way of hiding this, but again, just for doing a static site and for a test, we'll go ahead and be okay with being a little less secure for the time. We're going to do deployment token string equals, and we want list secrets. And I think I typoed that. Nope. And we want to grab the static site .id, and then we also need the API version of the static site. And that's pretty typical for when you want to reference anything with a resource in ARM or Bicep. They almost always want the ID of the thing and then the API version. And then we want to grab properties .api key. So the properties, almost everything has a properties. Not everything has an API key. That's just so we can publish it later. And I forgot this. So this will be now a referenceable variable when we get to our pipeline. So let's go ahead and get to the pipeline. So I should take a step back. Since we are here, this is all we have to do. This is going to set up, we've already pre-created our resource group. This is going to say, hey, when I publish to your resource group, I want you to spin up a static site of free tier, and then I want you to spit out the deployment token so I can reference it later on. That's all we need. So now you've written your first infrastructure as code application. Let's start publishing it. So, first thing we're going to do is we are going to create our file, and you'll notice this file format .github workflows. This is just how GitHub references their pipeline. So what we're going to do is on. That keyword is telling it when to run this pipeline. Typically, you want it to run on pushes to branches. So we're saying if you push to main, we want you to run. And for this one, we're also going to do, just to show notation, pull request, branches, main. So if my target of my pull request is also main, we're going to run this GitHub action. And then for authentication, we're going to need to get some permissions for the ID tokens. Which is going to be write and contents read. This is for when we go out to Azure and grab that token. We want GitHub to know that we're going to allow you to get that token and read it. And now we need to specify our job. So we're going to call this job build and deploy. And runs on. You can specify a OS here. I've noticed for the most part, JavaScript applications tend to run a little quicker on Linux than they do Windows. And since they're not really OS specific, I try to use that whenever possible. Now we need to specify our steps. Our first one is going to be uses action / checkout at v2, if I can type the at. So what this is going to do is it's going to show you, hey, first thing I want you to do is check out my code base and pull it into GitHub Actions so I can actually use it. Now we're going to want to log into Azure. And the name is just a referenceable name so we can see if something breaks, what step it broke on. At V1. And then we're going to use with. And now we're going to pass in all those variables I showed you before. So we're going to reference our client secret, our tenant ID, and our subscription secret. So now, at this point, we will have the code base in the pipeline. We'll have been logged into Azure. And we should be ready to build and publish our application. So what we're going to want to do is deploy our infrastructure. Again, just another human readable name, so if something happens, it will point us to the right direction. We're going to give this an ID because we're going to need to reference that deployment token I talked about earlier. So we're going to call it ID deploy. This is going to use Azure ARM deploy at v1. This is a little weird because we talked about how Bicep is pretty much better than ARM in most every way. However, if you're going to go and look up anything as far as deployment goes, they almost always reference it as ARM because Bicep does get transpiled and converted to ARM. So you'll see an ARM deployment task. That might be weird. Don't worry about it. It's still going to use your Bicep file because it'll behind the scenes convert it to ARM, then tell Azure what you actually wanted in ARM format. So after that, what we're going to do is we're going to pass it our subscription ID. With subscription ID colon, we're going to use this. Same secret as above. We're going to tell it the resource group. Again, this can be pulled out to a variable, or this can also be just hard-coded. One rule of thumb, or one reason you might want to pull it out from being hard-coded, is if you're going to make this pipeline a repeatable task for environments, you're probably going to want to pass in your resource groups and maybe have a singular, this is creating a service principal behind the scenes, or so you might want to have a singular connection that can get you to all your Azure resources from this particular pipeline. However, you might want to use the same pipeline to deploy to different resource groups or different environments. So pulling this out to a parameter could help you with that if you're going to start going down that path. And then we need to tell where our template is. And because it's at the root of our project and it's called deploy.bicep, it'll be right there. So now our application can connect, it can download our app or our code, and it can push our template to Azure. The next thing we're going to want to do is build and deploy our application. So there is a task for that, like a lot of things in Azure. We're going to call this build and deploy. And it uses Azure/static web apps deploy at v1. I can type, I promise. With Azure. So this is going to be the API, or the publish key deployment token that we talked about previously. And this is how we connect to the static site itself. So that is going to be referenced as so. We're going to want to do steps. So that tells us in our job, we're going to go to the steps section, dot deploy, which is the ID we did here, dot deployment token. So that is telling it, all right, we're going to go to steps. Once you've gone to steps, grab the ID deploy, and now this job should have output something called deployment token, which is what we called this. So that's taking this output and shoving it into here. Now we need a repo token. So this is saying giving the static web app job access to our GitHub repo. So it can look at the code base, build our project, and deploy it. Our action is going to be upload, because we want to upload our app. App location. So again, in our repository, our app location is /Angular Tour of Heroes, if you look right here. And finally, the app artifact location is going to be, if you've worked with Angular before, it's dist / your app name. You can customize a lot of this, but that's how it is kind of out of the box. And finally, the best rule of thumb is to always log out of your Azure and I forgot a colon. Log out of your Azure instance. So this is great. We have a web app. We log in. We build and deploy the infrastructure. We then build and deploy the app, and then we log out. You would think that would be it. There is one small thing if you want to keep this a full CI/CD pipeline that you have to do. Because a static web app is basically attaching a content delivery network or a URL to a file in blob storage, it gets pretty particular about that. So behind the scenes, what it'll do is it'll put a lock on that static content so that you can't accidentally delete it, which is nice, because if you have your static site and you think you deleted it, kind of stinks. However, if you're going to be doing a CI, continuous integration and continuous deployment, you need to unlock that file long enough so you can override it with new content as you push new code changes. So what we're going to want to do is, before we run our bicep deploy, because the resource is locked, and if we ever want to change our static site, we need to make that thing unlock prior to doing anything else. So, but we need to do it after we've logged into Azure to make sure that we have the right credentials to do that. So what we're going to do is we're going to run a quick CLI command. And it's going to use Azure CLI at v1 with sorry, I got lost there for a sec. With, and it's going to be an inline script. We're going to say easy static web app disconnect -n test site. So what that's going to do is it's going to briefly disconnect and undo that lock, so we then can change the infrastructure. We then can publish the new site, and when the new website gets published again, it's going to go back and re-lock that padlock so that you can't accidentally delete it or remove something. So with all of that said, we can go ahead and git push. And if we come over to here, we can see, let's go to our actions. We'll have a job that just ran. And everything should be green. So one thing that you can do, which is kind of cool, if you go to the static web app deployment and go through all of here, it'll tell you a bunch of information about everything. But at the very bottom, it'll actually output the URL that the site's at. So if you ever want to do that or have that, you can go in there and output this, whether that's for load testing or some of that. You could put a site up, try to load test it, Cypress. You can do all that and just tell it, like, hey, here's the URL. It's pretty sweet. And then you go here, and there is a HTTPS URL, so it's even secured by HTTPS. And for this conference, I changed the image to this. Otherwise, it's the Angular Tour of Heroes app. Nothing too crazy other than I put this huge image in it. There's also some other ways you can get to this. So if we go to portal, I can go to my resource group. And this may look a little weird. I do have Azure Mask on to hide any potentially secret information. You can find that URL here again. You can see the data in and out, the requests, and we're on page you go. So you might say, like, that's nice. Where's the proof that you're not actually paying for this, though? So if I go here, it's a resource group that holds my personal blog. If you're doing a Gatsby site, they have this pipeline already ready for you to copy and paste, which is pretty sweet. So if you go here, here's my personal website. Nothing too crazy, it's just a blog. And you can see that it's a static website. So if we go here, we can go to, let me see, go back up to the resource group, go to cost analytics or analysis, and we're not going to just do, we'll do all the way back for, let's do all of 2022 so far, what I've spent on this static site. So this will be the resource group, and you'll see no costs reported during this time. So this website does have some, if it'd help if I clicked on the right thing, some images, some text, and it's not costing me anything to host it here. The only thing that I am paying for, and it's not an Azure cost, is my pretty URL that I'll go out to a domain registry to pay for and then bring it into here. But yeah, so I have my 2 domains. I could also go to this ugly URL one that Azure gives me for free if I didn't care, or if I didn't want to pay for a custom domain and my users would just bookmark it, I can do that as well. One thing that you can do, which is kind of cool, is you can actually do environment branches. So if you want to have a branch here that is just for PRs, you can have a pull request and completely publish it all the way through to a live viewable environment, and we can see that here. So this is a second site of mine that's just standing up here that I can see an environment. So if I want to do like a pre-production preview, I can go out here and be like, does this blog post actually work? Yeah, looks good, all the content's good, cool, let's approve it, and then it'll go into to main or master, whatever your branch name is, and you have the more confidence that it's there. You can also use something like this if you want to do like Cypress testing or any UI in-depth testing as well, which is pretty sweet. And all of that is in a service that Azure does not charge you for. So I think it's worth the time to look into to investigate if your company or application can be hosted statically. I think it's a great thing with spas now as kind of being the more or less the standard application that you're going to be posting or publishing. That I think it's a cool service. It's pretty sweet. It's similar to S3 hosting in AWS. I think it's a little bit easier personally because you just kind of get a pretty URL, or you just kind of get a HTTPS URL. You don't have to do as much configuration. You can kind of just say it's there, push it, especially if you're going to be doing it personally and just doing it from VS Code. It's super slick, super easy to do if you're a solo developer. But yeah, otherwise, here's a screenshot I took. Sometimes this page takes forever to load just in case, but if you see all of 2021 again, no costs were reported for that app. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, you can find me at LinkedIn, email me. All of those are great methods. I will say probably LinkedIn messaging. Feel free to join the Iowa Microsoft Azure User Group. We're on Meetup, or the Kansas City Azure User Group if you're more remote, because those groups will be meeting remotely. Otherwise, I hope to see you all again soon, and I hope you have a good day. Thank you.